If you're a member of any of these organizations, if you support causes such as animal rights, handgun control, or federal subsidies for farmers, if you write letters to congressional representatives on behalf of groups like the National Rifle Association or Common Cause, then you're involved in what's known as interest group politics. Interest groups are a way for like-minded citizens to channel their energies into collective political action in an effort to influence legislation that favors their cause and goals. Some interest groups are focused on a single issue, such as protecting a specific endangered species. Others are organized around broader concerns, such as women's rights. Still other interest groups are formed to represent the views of business or labor. In fact, corporations and even entire industries can be interest groups in themselves, working to influence government through each of its branches. The result might be a tax break, a federal subsidy, favorable legislation, or other government perks, creating what some critics point to as corporate freeloaders.
Congress takes your money through the income tax, tariffs, and fees and pours it into a feeding trough for the well-connected.
Sunkist needs taxpayer help to sell oranges?
Many people see campaign contributions by business and labor organizations as a blatant attempt to buy political favor.
I told them in Iowa I was for ethanol, and I'm going to be for ethanol.
In spite of their self-serving nature, interest groups serve a variety of functions. They provide a vehicle for grassroots political participation. They channel information on key issues to the general public. They also monitor the performance of federal officials and programs as educators, consensus builders, or watchdogs. Interest groups are an important aspect of the political system in the United States.
The United States has approximately 2% of its original forest that has been unentered, uncut, undeveloped. 2% of the original 100%. That's all that's left of the ancient forests. And all that, virtually all of that, is on public land in the People's Forest.
The bark is used for landscaping material. The chips from the rounded outer portion of the log go to pulp and paper manufacturer. Sawdust and the planer shavings are used for particle board manufacture, or we also use some of our sawdust as fuel for our boiler.
We are a non-landowning company. We're a manufacturer, but we do not own the resource from which our basic raw material comes from. In other words, forests. So we will go out and competitively bid for harvesting rights on areas of the national forest.
The fate of these forests is uncertain, while the timber industry sees the trees as a vital economic resource. To environmentalists, they represent a natural heritage that should be allowed to stand.
In order for this place to be economically viable, not just this place, our company, but this place, our county, we need to be making use of what's there, but we have to make use of it wisely.
Should we subsidize the timber industry to cut the rest of those forests that haven't been cut already? Or should we preserve those for future generations? We would say we should preserve those for future generations.
Good morning, Sierra Club.
Beyond the local conflict, the use of national forests has become a national debate, with environmental groups on one side representing public interests and industry groups on the other advocating the interests of private business.
The American Forest and Paper Association is the national trade group which represents U.S. forest and paper companies. Some of the major issues that our industry has to deal with here in Washington and in state capitals around the country have to do with forest resources. Specifically, to what extent forests ought to be preserved as a valuable ecosystem, and at the same time, to what extent and how are they going to be used for the forest products that all of us use, paper and wood products that are used in every home and in every office and every school.
When an issue involves federal regulations and congressional action, as this one does, interest groups, to be effective, must take their case to government officials.
We do try to talk to decision makers here in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately we can't compete with industry opponents in terms of dollars. Sometimes money talks louder than words. So we really try to focus on our strength, which is our volunteer membership and citizen activists all over the country.
Like many national and local groups that share the same concerns, the Sierra Club and Klamath Forest Alliance work in partnership to advance their cause.
When the Forest Service, as they did last winter, decides to allow the loggers wet winter to log in the mud and to create a lot of watershed damage as a result, the Sierra Club, based in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., doesn't know about it. But we live in the communities. We know everything that goes on here. We know about it. We then put out some alerts to the network of national environmental groups and other groups. The Sierra Club's person in Washington, D.C. could take those pictures of the mud and the loggers working in the mud and the mud going into the stream and take those directly into the head of the Forest Service, maybe even at times the Vice President, and lay those pictures down and say, this is what's going on out in the National Forest. We want you to do something about it.
The U.S. Forest Service, the federal agency that is charged with managing those national forests, have become, in our view, too much of an extension of private timber industry.
We're really a watchdog group on these public agencies to see that they're doing the job that the law says they're supposed to do in managing our forests. There is ordinarily an administrative appeal process on the public land. So when the Forest Service supervisor or ranger makes a decision to sell timber sale X, if we don't like that decision and we think it's wrong or illegal, we can appeal it to the next level. And if we have to, we'll go further and file lawsuits.
But that's sort of a last resort, and we try to avoid going to the courts by affecting policy up front and getting our decision makers to pursue wise policy of forest resources and comply with our environmental laws.
When Congress recently put limits on citizen appeals, it opened the door to what some activists describe as further mismanagement of our national forests.
They went hog wild, and they put up sales like the Dillon sale. The Dillon Creek area is one of the wildest watersheds remaining on the West Coast. It also contains lands that are sacred to 3 Native American tribes. We tried to organize people and use public education and political pressure on the Clinton administration to stop that sale. And some people engaged in a road blockade, in nonviolent civil disobedience.
You have to stop them and say no. We have to convince local people that this is affecting their water, their fisheries, their livelihood.
And this is being done primarily by young people who don't have a lot of expertise or ability to do the kinds of things that I do, but have a lot of idealism and want to do something to save the forest.
There's a constant dialogue and debate going on, and it depends to a large extent on how much information we as an industry can bring to the regulators. So a lot of our work has to do with finding the right information being the first at the table with the best information.
I've testified before Congress, done a lot of letter writing, met with congressional staff, congressmen, trying to give voice to our concerns and issues.
Companies have to start taking a leadership position instead of simply always fighting and complaining about these regulations. They have to see where the government has, and the public has, a legitimate interest, and where that legitimate interest exists, finding ways to do it better.
Between economic security and environmental concern, can there be a common ground?
We haven't preserved our watersheds. We haven't even begun to restore our forested watersheds because the ancient trees are still gone down the highway to the mill. And we won't be satisfied until all the remaining ancient forests are preserved.
Our view would be that these national forests, or all of these forest lands, private as well, can be used in a sustainable way in perpetuity. They really form, we feel, the backbone for rural communities such as ours that are really quite dependent on the resources that surround them.
The bombs that damaged the World Trade Center in 1994 and destroyed a federal building in Oklahoma City 1 year later shattered the nation's sense of safety and security. The Clinton administration responded by proposing tough anti-terrorism legislation.
These measures will strengthen law enforcement and sharpen their ability to crack down terrorists wherever they're from. This will arm them with new investigative tools, increased enforcement, and tougher penalties.
The American Civil Liberties Union, a broad-based interest group concerned with safeguarding constitutional freedoms, opposed the bill.
The terrorism bill was basically an anti-immigration and crime bill. It had very little to do with domestic terrorism and everything to do with the rights of people to protest in this country. The immigration section of the terrorism bill allows people to be deported from this country without even knowing what the charges are against them. So you can be here for years legally, and all of a sudden the INS, the FBI, can round you up and say, you have to leave. And they can claim, based on national security concerns, we don't have to tell you why we're deporting you, you just have to leave. And one of the fundamental rights of people who are on our shores is the right to know what the charges are against you.
In voicing opposition to the bill, the ACLU discovered that it had an unlikely ally.
First of all, it's the right of police to go into a person's home or abode or business and do a search without going through the court system of this country. After all, there is a presumption of innocence in this country, and that presumption should only be broken when there is a severe cause that can be justified to a magistrate or a court of the land.
People were saying, how could you stand up there with the NRA? Aren't they Republicans? You're a liberal ACLU. Well, this was a matter of civil liberties, and civil liberties knows no party. We found that the National Rifle Association was concerned about the wiretapping provisions of the terrorism bill, and the ACLU was concerned about the expansion of federal wiretapping. The NRA is opposed to wiretapping too, and they joined with the ACLU along with groups that have worked on international issues, Irish American groups, anti-apartheid groups, religious groups that are concerned about U.S. policies abroad, and we had the wildest coalition that you can ever imagine.